How could a man who gave his daughter everything end up seeing her and his grandchild begging for food at a charity kitchen? When I learned my son-in-law and his mother had seized the apartment I bought for my daughter, I decided to show them just how powerless they really were. People thought I was a harmless, aging father, but they forgot who owned the deeds, the evidence, and the patience to turn humiliation into reckoning. The fluorescent lights of the Riverside Community Kitchen cast harsh shadows across the linoleum floor as I stepped through the double doors, carrying a box of canned goods I'd brought for donation. The familiar smell of industrial-grade soup and disinfectant filled my nostrils as I made my way toward the volunteer check-in table. I'd been coming here twice a month for the past year, ever since my retirement from the construction management firm. It gave me purpose, something to fill the empty hours that stretched endlessly through my days. But today was different. Today, my world tilted off its axis. Standing in the food line, clutching a small paper bag and holding the hand of a 3-year-old boy with sandy brown hair, was my daughter Allison. My 27-year-old daughter, who should have been safe in the 2-bedroom apartment I'd purchased for her family just 18 months ago. The apartment I'd bought outright, no mortgage, as a wedding gift when she married Tanner Benson. I froze, the box of canned goods slipping from my hands and crashing to the floor. The noise rang through the kitchen like a sudden explosion, drawing several heads in my direction. But I barely noticed. All I could see was Allison's face, thin, exhausted, wearing the same clothes I'd seen her in 3 days ago. Her auburn hair, once glossy and carefully styled, hung limp around her shoulders. Heavy shadows framed her green eyes, the same eyes she'd inherited from her mother. "Allison?" My voice came out as a croak, barely audible over the din of conversation and clattering dishes. She looked up, and the expression that crossed her face nearly broke my heart. Shame, fear, and something that looked almost like relief warred across her features. Little Ethan, my grandson, tugged at her sleeve, his innocent blue eyes wide with confusion. "Grandpa Frank?" Ethan's voice was small and uncertain. "Are you getting food too?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I walked toward them on unsteady legs, my mind reeling with questions and a growing sense of dread. The other people in line stepped aside respectfully, recognizing the gravity of whatever family drama was unfolding before them. "Allison, what are you doing here?" I kept my voice low, trying not to draw more attention than we already had. "Where's the apartment? Where's Tanner?" Her face crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. She pulled Ethan closer to her side, as if shielding him from the conversation that was about to unfold. "Dad, I didn't know where else to go." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Tanner and his mother, they said I had no rights to the apartment. They changed the locks 3 days ago while I was at the grocery store with Ethan. When I came back, all our things were on the sidewalk." The words hit me like a series of physical blows. "What do you mean, no rights? I bought that apartment for you. The deed has your name on it." Allison shook her head frantically, her tears falling faster now. "Tanner said the deed was just a formality, that since I'm married to him, everything belongs to both of us. And his mother, Darlene, she said that since Tanner is the man of the house, he gets to decide who lives there. She moved in last month, remember? She said she needed help after her divorce, and Tanner insisted we take her in." I remembered. Darlene Benson, a sharp-tongued woman in her mid-50s with bleached blonde hair and a perpetual look of disdain. She'd never liked me, had made that clear from the moment Tanner introduced us. She thought I was weak, too soft with my daughter. She'd made snide comments about my modest lifestyle and had questioned whether I could really afford such a generous wedding gift. "They can't just kick you out," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to keep it low. "It's your home. I have the paperwork to prove it." Tanner said the paperwork doesn't matter. Allison's voice broke completely now. "He said I signed documents when we got married that gave him control over our assets. He said if I tried to fight it, he'd make sure I never saw Ethan again." "And Darlene," she laughed. "Dad." She actually laughed and said that men like you don't understand how the real world works. Leonard Grant, the charity kitchen manager, approached us with concern, etched across his weathered face. He was a kind man in his early 60s who'd been running this place for over a decade. I'd gotten to know him well during my volunteer shifts. "Everything all right here, Franklin?" he asked gently. I couldn't help but notice. "This is my daughter and grandson," I said, my voice tight with emotion. "They're going through a difficult time." Leonard nodded, understanding. "We've got a quiet room in the back if you folks need to talk privately, and don't worry about the food, we'll make sure they're taken care of." I looked down at Ethan, who was clutching a small stuffed dinosaur and looking between his mother and me with growing anxiety. The sight of my grandson, bright, innocent, and now homeless because of the cruelty of 2 people who should have protected him, ignited something fierce and protective in my chest. Allison, get out of this line right now, I said firmly. You and Ethan are coming home with me. But Dad, I can't just... Now. My voice carried a tone of authority I hadn't used since she was a teenager. We're leaving. Both of you. As I guided my daughter and grandson toward the exit, I caught fragments of whispered conversations from the other patrons and volunteers. I heard someone say, "Isn't that the man who bought his daughter that nice apartment on Maple Street?" Another voice responded. "Poor thing, wonder what happened." The humiliation burned in my chest, but it was nothing compared to the cold fury that was beginning to build. Tanner and Darlene had not only stolen my daughter's home, they'd reduced her to standing in a charity food line with my grandson. They'd stripped away her dignity, her security, and her sense of safety. As we reached my car, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I saw a photo that sent a chill straight through me. It showed Tanner and Darlene sitting in the living room of the apartment I'd bought for Allison. They were raising champagne glasses in a toast, grinning at the camera. Darlene was wearing what looked like one of Allison's necklaces. The message below the photo read, "Thanks for the housewarming gift, old man. Don't bother coming around." I stared at the photo for a long moment, memorizing every detail. Then I deleted the message and helped my daughter and grandson into my car. As I drove toward my modest suburban home, my mind was already beginning to work, planning and calculating. Tanner and Darlene thought they'd won. They thought they'd outmaneuvered a harmless old man who was too soft to fight back. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Back at my house on Elm Street, I settled Allison and Ethan in the guest room while my mind churned through memories I'd been too naive to recognize as warning signs. The house felt different with them there, warmer, but tinged with the sadness of circumstances that should never have happened. As Allison tucked Ethan into bed, I found myself thinking back to the day I'd bought that apartment. It had been a crisp October morning, and I'd walked through the two-bedroom unit on Maple Street with my real estate agent, Margaret Winters. The apartment was on the third floor of a well-maintained building, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light and a small balcony overlooking the courtyard. "It's perfect for a young family," Margaret had said, making notes on her clipboard. "The school district is excellent, and it's close to the park." I'd paid the full purchase price of $185,000 in cash, money I'd saved for decades, living modestly and investing carefully. When I handed Allison the keys at her wedding reception, her face had lit up with joy and gratitude. Tanner had shaken my hand and called me the most generous father-in-law a guy could ask for. Even then, I'd noticed how his eyes had lingered on the deed paperwork, studying it with an intensity that should have set off alarm bells. But it was Darlene's reaction that should have warned me. While everyone else celebrated, she'd pulled Tanner aside and whispered something in his ear that made his expression shift. Later, I'd overheard her telling another wedding guest, "Well, I suppose Franklin thinks this makes him important. Some men need to feel useful, even when they're past their prime." Now, sitting in my living room while Allison tried to calm a confused and frightened Ethan, those memories took on a sinister new meaning. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Marcia O'Neill, the real estate attorney who'd handled the apartment purchase. It was late, but I sent her a text asking if she could meet with me the next day. I needed to understand exactly what legal rights Allison had and what Tanner and Darlene thought they could get away with. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent listening to Ethan's occasional whimpers and Allison's muffled sobs through the thin walls, I drove to the apartment building on Maple Street. I needed to see the situation for myself, to understand how my daughter had been so completely erased from her own home. The building looked the same from the outside. Red brick facade, well-maintained entrance, small garden area where I'd watched Ethan play just weeks before. But as I approached the front door, I was intercepted by Carla Newton, the building superintendent. She was a practical woman in her late 30s with short brown hair and calloused hands that spoke of years of maintenance work. "Mr. Carver," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting to see you today." "I'm here to check on my daughter's apartment," I replied. "There seems to be some confusion about the living arrangements." Carla's expression grew uncomfortable. "Well, sir, that's complicated. Mrs. Benson, Darlene Benson, she's been handling all the apartment business lately. She said there were some changes in the family situation." "What kind of changes?" "She said your daughter had some problems, mental health issues. Said she wasn't capable of managing the apartment anymore and that the family had to step in." Carla looked genuinely troubled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carver. I know you're a good man, but Mrs. Benson, she had paperwork and everything." The lie was so audacious, so cruel, that for a moment I couldn't speak. They hadn't just stolen Allison's home, they'd destroyed her reputation in the process, painting her as mentally unstable to anyone who might question their actions. Carla, I said carefully, I need you to understand something. I am the legal owner of apartment 3A. I bought it for my daughter. Whatever paperwork Darlene Benson showed you, it doesn't change that fact. Carla's eyes widened slightly. But she said the ownership had been transferred, that there were legal complications because of your daughter's condition. My daughter has no mental health issues. She's been manipulated and abused by her husband and his mother. They've stolen her home and spread lies about her to cover their tracks. I could see the wheels turning in Carla's mind, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. You know, she said slowly, I did think it was strange how quickly everything changed. And Mrs. Benson, she's been demanding, very different from how your daughter always was. Before I could respond, I heard footsteps on the stairs inside the building. Through the glass door, I could see Tanner Benson descending toward the lobby. He was a tall man in his early 30s, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of vanity and self-importance. His dark hair was styled with expensive product, and he wore a designer polo shirt that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Tanner pushed through the door and stopped short when he saw me. For just a moment, I caught a flicker of something, surprise, maybe even guilt, before his expression hardened into the arrogant mask I'd grown to despise. Frank, he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. What brings you by? I thought Allison would have explained the situation to you by now. She explained that you and your mother stole her apartment and threw her out on the street with my grandson, I replied evenly. Tanner laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. Stole? That's a strong word, Frank. Allison was having some difficulties, and we had to make some hard decisions for everyone's safety, including Ethan's. The implication that my daughter was somehow dangerous to her own child made my hands clench into fists, but I forced myself to remain calm. Getting into a physical altercation wouldn't help Allison or Ethan. I'd like to see the apartment, I said, since I'm the legal owner. Actually, that's not how it works anymore, Tanner replied smoothly. When Allison and I got married, certain property rights transferred, and given her current mental state, I've had to take control of the situation, for everyone's protection. What mental state would that be, Tanner? Come on, Frank, you've seen how she's been lately. Paranoid, emotional, making wild accusations. The stress of motherhood has been too much for her. My mother moved in to help, but Allison became increasingly hostile and unstable. We had no choice but to ask her to leave until she gets the help she needs. The lies flowed from his mouth so smoothly, so convincingly, that I could see how he'd managed to fool Carla and probably others in the building. But I knew my daughter. I'd raised her from birth, watched her grow into a kind, intelligent, capable woman. The instability Tanner described was nothing more than her natural reaction to being gaslighted and abused. Where is she staying? Tanner asked with false concern. I hope she's somewhere safe, with Ethan to think about. She's with me, I said, where she should have been able to stay all along, in her own home. Tanner's expression shifted slightly, a hint of genuine anger breaking through his facade. Frank, I'm going to say this once, and I hope you'll listen. This situation is between Allison and me. We're married, we're adults, and we don't need her father interfering in our private business. The apartment situation has been handled legally and appropriately. I suggest you encourage Allison to get the help she needs instead of enabling her delusions. The only delusion here, I said quietly, is your belief that you can steal from my family without consequences. Tanner stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. You gave that apartment away, old man. You signed the papers, you handed over the keys, and now it belongs to my family. You have no say in what happens there anymore. And if you keep interfering, if you keep filling Allison's head with ideas about fighting this, I'll make sure she never sees her son again. I have documentation of her mental instability. I have witnesses who'll testify to her erratic behavior. Do you really want to put her through a custody battle she can't win? The threat hung in the air between us like a blade. Tanner was betting that I'd back down, that I'd choose the path of least resistance to avoid putting Allison through more trauma. He was counting on my love for my daughter to make me weak. He'd miscalculated. We'll see about that, I said simply, then turned and walked back to my car. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of Tanner in my rearview mirror. He was standing on the sidewalk, talking animatedly on his phone, probably calling his mother to report on our conversation, probably laughing about how they'd put the old man in his place. Let them laugh. Let them think they'd won. I had work to do. The law office of Marcia O'Neill occupied the third floor of a converted Victorian house downtown, its rooms filled with the comfortable clutter of legal books, case files, and the accumulated wisdom of 20 years of practice. Marcia herself was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of direct manner that came from dealing with liars and manipulators on a daily basis. I'd worked with Marcia on the apartment purchase, and she'd always struck me as someone who didn't suffer fools gladly. As I sat across from her desk, laying out the situation with Allison, I watched her expression grow increasingly grim. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said, leaning back in her leather chair. "Tanner and his mother have physically barred your daughter from entering the apartment you purchased for her. They've changed the locks, removed her belongings, and are now claiming legal authority over the property based on marriage rights and alleged mental incapacity." "That's correct. And they've spread rumors in the building that Allison is mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to her own child." "Yes." Marcia picked up a pen and began making notes on a legal pad. "Franklin, I need you to understand something. What they're doing isn't just morally reprehensible, it's potentially criminal. You can't simply decide someone is mentally incompetent and seize their property. There are legal procedures, court orders, medical evaluations, none of which have happened here." "So Allison has rights?" "Allison has extensive rights. The apartment is held in her name as separate property, not marital property. The deed is clear on this point. Tanner has no legal claim to exclude her from the premises." Marcia's expression hardened. "What's more, if they've been intercepting her mail or forging documents, we're looking at potential federal crimes." A cold satisfaction settled in my chest. "What do we need to do?" "First, I need you to gather every piece of documentation related to the apartment purchase. Deed, title insurance, any correspondence with the seller or real estate agents. Second, I want you to document everything Tanner and his mother have done. Dates, times, witnesses, if possible. Third, we need to be strategic about how we handle this." "Strategic how?" Marcia smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "Franklin, these people have made a critical error. They've assumed you're powerless because you're older, because you're not married to Allison, because you seem like a gentle man who won't fight back. They've gotten comfortable in their theft. Comfortable people make mistakes." I left Marcia's office with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. But first, I needed to see the apartment situation for myself, to understand exactly how Tanner and Darlene were living in the space I'd bought for my daughter. The apartment building on Maple Street looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. I made my way to the third floor, my footsteps echoing in the carpeted hallway. As I approached apartment 3A, I could hear voices inside, Tanner's deep laugh and Darlene's sharp nasal tones. I knocked on the door. The voices inside went silent. After a long moment, I heard footsteps approaching, and then Darlene's voice called out, "Who is it?" "It's Franklin Carver. I'd like to speak with you." More silence. Then the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened to reveal Darlene Benson, and I was struck by how at home she looked. She was wearing a silk robe that I was fairly certain had belonged to Allison, and her bleached hair was styled as if she'd just returned from a salon appointment. "Franklin," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What a surprise. I thought Tanner made it clear that this situation was handled." "I'd like to see the apartment," I said, "since I own it." Darlene's expression shifted, the mask of politeness dropping away to reveal something cold and calculating. "Actually, you don't own it anymore. Property rights transfer when people get married, especially when one spouse becomes unstable." "That's not how property law works, Darlene." "Isn't it?" She stepped aside slightly, allowing me to see into the living room. What I saw there made my stomach turn. The apartment had been completely transformed. Allison's furniture, the couch we'd picked out together, the coffee table that had been her grandmother's, the family photos that had covered the mantelpiece, all of it was gone. In its place was furniture I didn't recognize, expensive-looking pieces that spoke of money and poor taste. The walls, which Allison had painted a warm yellow, had been repainted in stark white. Tanner appeared behind his mother, wearing the same arrogant expression I'd seen in the lobby. "Frank, you really need to stop this. You're embarrassing yourself." "Where are my daughter's belongings?" "We donated most of it," Darlene said with a dismissive wave. "Goodwill, I think. It was all so shabby, and we needed to make room for proper furniture." The casual cruelty of it, disposing of my daughter's life like it was garbage, sent a surge of rage through my system, but I forced myself to remain calm, to observe and remember everything I was seeing. "You had no right to dispose of her property." "We had every right," Tanner said. "Allison abandoned the apartment when she left. Legally, that constitutes forfeiture of any claim to the contents." "She didn't abandon anything. You threw her out." Darlene laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Franklin, you really don't understand how the world works, do you? Men like you think being nice and generous makes you important. You think buying your daughter an apartment makes you some kind of patriarch, but you're not. You're just a lonely old man who's outlived his usefulness." The words were designed to wound, to make me feel small and powerless. And perhaps, once upon a time, they might have worked. But as I stood there, looking at these two parasites who'd invaded my daughter's home and destroyed her life, all I felt was a cold, calculating fury. "I think we're done here," Tanner said, moving to close the door. "Don't come back, Frank. Next time I'll call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The door slammed shut, and I heard the locks clicking back into place. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of their laughter from inside. They thought they'd humiliated me. They thought they'd shown me my place in their new hierarchy. They had no idea what they'd actually done. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed with a text message. This one was from Greg Harlan, a neighbor who lived in the same building. Greg was a quiet man in his late 40s who worked as an accountant and had always been friendly during my visits to see Allison. The message was brief. "Can we talk? I have something you need to see." I called Greg immediately. "What is it?" "Not over the phone," he said. "Can you meet me at Murphy's coffee shop on 3rd Street? There are things you need to know about what's been happening here." 20 minutes later, I sat across from Greg in a corner booth at Murphy's, watching him fidget with his coffee cup. He looked nervous, like a man who was about to cross a line he couldn't uncross. "I've been debating whether to get involved," he said finally. "But what I saw last week, I can't just ignore it." "What did you see?" Greg pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos. "I was coming home late from work. Around 11 p.m., I saw Tanner and his mother loading garbage bags into a dumpster behind the building. Lots of bags. I thought it was strange because we have regular pickup, and it wasn't pickup day." He showed me a photo taken from his apartment window. It was grainy and taken from a distance, but I could clearly see Tanner and Darlene throwing bag after bag into the dumpster. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 days ago, the same day Allison had been locked out. "I went down to look after they went back inside," Greg continued. Some of the bags had torn open. "Franklin, they were throwing away family photos, children's toys, clothes, personal stuff that nobody throws away unless they're trying to erase someone." My hands clenched around my coffee cup. "Did you take pictures of that too?" "I did, and I kept some things." Greg reached into a backpack beside his chair and pulled out a small photo album. I recognized this from when Allison used to show me pictures of Ethan. I couldn't let them just throw it away. I opened the album with trembling fingers. It was filled with photos of Ethan's first steps, his first birthday, family Christmas mornings. Pictures of Allison and me at the park, at his preschool graduation, at dozens of small moments that made up the fabric of a family's life. "There's more," Greg said quietly. "I've been hearing arguments through the walls. Tanner and his mother, they've been planning this for months. I heard Darlene say something about how easy it would be to have Allison declared incompetent once they established a pattern of erratic behavior." "You heard them planning this?" "I did. And Franklin, there's something else. I've seen mail being delivered to your daughter's name, but Darlene's been intercepting it. Bank statements, legal documents, everything. She's been forging Allison's signature on return receipts. Federal mail tampering, document fraud, conspiracy." The list of crimes was growing, and with it, my sense of cold satisfaction. Tanner and Darlene thought they were so clever, so untouchable. They had no idea how thoroughly they'd documented their own guilt. "Greg, would you be willing to make a statement about what you've seen?" He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about it. What they did to Allison, to that little boy, it's not right. I'll testify if you need me to. As I drove home that evening, my phone rang. It was Carla Newton, the building superintendent. "Mr. Carver, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the emergency contact list." "What can I do for you, Carla?" "It's about what you said earlier, about the apartment ownership. I've been thinking, and there are some things that don't add up. Mrs. Benson, she's been very insistent about being added to all the building communications. She wanted copies of the lease agreements, maintenance records, everything. Said she needed them for legal purposes." "What kind of legal purposes?" "She wouldn't say exactly. But Mr. Carver, I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I've never seen someone move so fast to take over an apartment that wasn't legally theirs. It's like she was following a checklist." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Darlene hadn't just seized the apartment on impulse. This had been planned, methodical, executed with the precision of someone who'd thought through every angle. Except one. They'd assumed I would be too weak, too old, too intimidated to fight back effectively. They'd counted on my love for my daughter making me cautious, making me afraid to rock the boat. It was the kind of mistake that destroyed people. When I got home, I found Allison in the kitchen, helping Ethan with a coloring book while dinner simmered on the stove. She looked up when I entered, hope and fear warring in her expression. "How did it go with the lawyer?" I sat down beside my grandson, who was carefully coloring a dinosaur in shades of purple and green. "We're going to get your apartment back, sweetheart. All of it. But Tanner says a lot of things. Most of them are lies." I looked directly into her eyes. "Allison, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She nodded, tears beginning to form. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I should have fought harder. I should have called you immediately when they started threatening me. You did nothing wrong. You were outnumbered, isolated, and scared for your son. That's exactly what they were counting on." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "But that's over now. Now they're going to learn what happens when you steal from my family." That night, after Allison and Ethan were asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began making lists. Names, dates, witnesses, evidence. Every conversation, every threat, every lie Tanner and Darlene had told. I wrote until my hand cramped, until I had a comprehensive timeline of exactly how they'd stolen my daughter's life. And then I began planning how I was going to take it back. The next morning brought an unexpected gift. As I was reviewing my notes over coffee, my phone rang. It was Carla Newton, and she sounded excited. "Mr. Carver, you need to come to the building. There's something you have to see." "What is it?" "Just come, and bring your lawyer if you can." An hour later, Marcia and I stood in the basement mailroom of the apartment building, watching Carla unlock a storage closet filled with maintenance records and building documents. I couldn't sleep last night thinking about what you said," Carla explained, pulling out a thick folder. "So I went through all my records for apartment 3A. Look at this." She handed me a stack of maintenance request forms dating back 6 months. Each one was signed with Allison's name, but as I looked closer, I could see the signatures were different. Some were close approximations, others were obviously forged. "I never really paid attention before," Carla said, "but looking at them all together, it's clear that someone else has been signing your daughter's name. And look at the dates. Some of these requests were made when I know for a fact that Allison was out of town visiting her aunt in Denver." Marcia examined the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every type of fraud imaginable. "This is excellent evidence. It shows a pattern of document forgery going back months. They've been planning this takeover for a long time." "There's more," Carla said, pulling out another folder. "Mrs. Benson has been very insistent about getting copies of all the building's insurance documents, lease agreements, and property records. She said she needed them because she was going to be taking over the apartment management for the family. She even asked about the procedure for changing the deed." "She asked about changing the deed?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "She did. Said there might be some legal complications with the current ownership structure, and wanted to know what paperwork would be needed to transfer the property to Tanner's name." Marcia and I exchanged glances. We weren't just dealing with theft and harassment. We were looking at an attempted property fraud scheme. "Carla, I need copies of everything," Marcia said. "Every forged signature, every suspicious request, every conversation you remember having with Darlene Benson about the apartment." "Already made them," Carla said, handing over a thick envelope. "And Mr. Carver, there's one more thing. Mrs. Benson has been telling other tenants that you're mentally declining and that Allison has serious substance issues. She's been poisoning the well, making sure that if anyone asks questions, they'll think the family is just trying to help a troubled woman and her aging father." The systematic nature of their campaign was breathtaking in its cruelty. They hadn't just stolen Allison's home. They destroyed her reputation and mine in the process, creating a narrative that would make it difficult for anyone to believe our side of the story. But they'd made one critical error. They'd assumed their lies would never be challenged by hard evidence. After leaving the building, Marcia and I drove to the courthouse to research the property records. What we found there added another layer to their scheme. Someone had indeed filed preliminary paperwork to challenge the apartment's ownership, claiming that the original deed transfer had been made under undue influence and that Franklin Carver lacked the mental capacity to make such a significant financial decision. "They're trying to have the original gift declared invalid," Marcia explained as we reviewed the documents. "If they could prove you were mentally incompetent when you bought the apartment for Allison, they could argue that the transfer was legally void." "Can they do that?" "Not without a court hearing, medical evaluations, and substantial evidence. But it shows how far they're willing to go. They're not just stealing the apartment, they're trying to steal it legally." That afternoon, I decided to visit Murphy's coffee shop again, this time to observe rather than meet. I'd learned that Tanner and Darlene had been frequenting the place, and I wanted to see how they behaved when they thought they were among friends. I chose a corner table with a clear view of the entrance and waited. It didn't take long. At precisely 2:30 p.m., Tanner and Darlene entered the coffee shop, talking animatedly and laughing about something. They ordered expensive drinks and settled at a table near the window. I couldn't hear their entire conversation, but I caught enough fragments to understand the general tone. They were discussing their plans for the apartment, talking about renovations and improvements they wanted to make. Darlene mentioned something about finally having a decent place to live, and Tanner laughed about the old man's generous donation. But it was what happened next that provided the most valuable intelligence. A woman I didn't recognize approached their table, apparently a friend of Darlene's from her job at the department store. "How's the new place working out?" the woman asked. "Oh, it's wonderful," Darlene replied, her voice carrying clearly across the coffee shop. Tanner's father-in-law bought it for them, but the poor girl just couldn't handle the responsibility. Mental problems, you know. We had to step in for the child's sake. "That's so generous of you," the woman said. "It must be difficult, dealing with family issues like that." Tanner leaned forward conspiratorially. "The father-in-law means well, but he's getting up there in years. Doesn't really understand the situation. We're hoping to get everything sorted out legally soon for everyone's protection." "You mean like guardianship?" "Something like that," Darlene said with a smile that made my skin crawl. "Sometimes families need to make hard decisions to protect their most vulnerable members." I sat there, sipping my coffee and listening to them discuss my daughter and me like we were problems to be managed rather than people they'd wronged. The casual way they'd constructed their narrative, the ease with which they lied to a virtual stranger, told me everything I needed to know about their character. But it also told me something else. They were overconfident. They'd gotten so comfortable with their lies that they were sharing them publicly, creating witnesses to their fraud. As I prepared to leave, I overheard Darlene mention something that made me pause. "We should probably do something about the building's community meeting next week," she said to Tanner. "Make sure people understand the situation with the apartment." "What community meeting?" "The monthly tenant meeting. They're discussing building improvements and lease renewals. It might be a good opportunity to establish our legitimacy as residents." Tanner nodded. "Good thinking. We should probably attend, make sure everyone knows we're the stable, responsible tenants now." A community meeting. A public forum where Tanner and Darlene planned to further cement their lies about my daughter and solidify their claim to the apartment. It was exactly the opportunity I'd been waiting for. Over the next few days, I worked with Marcia to prepare a comprehensive case file. We had the original deed and purchase documents. We had Greg's photos of Tanner and Darlene disposing of Allison's belongings. We had Carla's records of forged signatures and suspicious requests. We had documentation of mail tampering and evidence of their systematic campaign to destroy Allison's reputation. But most importantly, we had a plan. The community meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the building's common room. According to the notice posted in the lobby, it would cover routine building business, lease renewals, and any concerns residents might have about building security and tenant screening procedures. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday making final preparations. I contacted Greg Harlan and Carla Newton, confirming their willingness to speak publicly about what they'd witnessed. I arranged for Marcia to attend the meeting as my legal representative. I even reached out to Leonard Grant from the Charity Kitchen, who agreed to provide a character reference for Allison if needed. But the most important preparation was emotional. I sat down with Allison and explained what we were going to do. "Dad, I don't know if I can face them," she said, her voice trembling. "What if Tanner follows through on his threats about Ethan?" "He can't take Ethan away from you," I said firmly. "We have evidence that Tanner and his mother are the unstable ones. We have proof of their lies, their theft, their systematic abuse. By the time we're done, no court in the country would consider giving them custody of a goldfish, let alone a child. But what if people don't believe us? What if they've convinced everyone that I'm crazy?" I took her hands in mine. "Allison, I need you to remember something. You are not crazy. You are not unstable. You are not the problem. You are a good mother who was victimized by two cruel, greedy people who thought they could steal from our family without consequences. And tomorrow night, everyone is going to learn the truth." Thursday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth and clear skies. As I prepared to leave for the community meeting, I felt the kind of calm focus that used to come over me during the most challenging construction projects. Everything was planned, every detail accounted for, every contingency prepared for. Allison decided to stay home with Ethan, but she hugged me tightly before I left. "Bring me home, Dad," she whispered. "I will," I promised. "I'm bringing you both home." The apartment building's common room was buzzing with conversation when I arrived at 7 p.m. About 20 residents had gathered for the monthly meeting, sitting in folding chairs arranged in a rough circle around a small podium. I recognized most of the faces from my previous visits to see Allison, though I noticed several people avoiding eye contact when they saw me enter. Tanner and Darlene were already there, sitting in the front row like honored guests. Darlene had dressed for the occasion in an expensive-looking blazer and pearls, probably purchased with money they'd saved by stealing my daughter's home. Tanner wore a crisp button-down shirt and khakis, projecting the image of a responsible young professional. They looked surprised to see me, but not alarmed. If anything, Tanner seemed amused, as if my presence at the meeting was exactly the kind of pathetic gesture he'd expected from a defeated old man. I took a seat in the back row, next to Greg Harlan, who gave me a subtle nod of support. Carla Newton was sitting near the front, her expression carefully neutral as she prepared to run the meeting in her capacity as building superintendent. Marcia O'Neill arrived a few minutes later, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that made people nervous. She took a seat beside me without acknowledging Tanner or Darlene, though I noticed both of them watching her with increased attention. "Good evening, everyone," Carla said, calling the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming. We have several items on tonight's agenda, including some building maintenance updates, a discussion about lease renewals, and an open floor for any resident concerns." The first 20 minutes of the meeting were routine business, discussions about hallway lighting, plans for updating the laundry room, and a proposal to install security cameras in the lobby. Tanner and Darlene participated actively, asking thoughtful questions and offering suggestions with the confidence of people who belonged there. I sat quietly, observing and waiting. Several times I caught other residents glancing in my direction with expressions that ranged from pity to suspicion. Darlene's poison had done its work. I could see that many of them had already accepted the narrative that I was a confused old man whose daughter had serious problems. That was about to change. "Now," Carla said, consulting her notes, "we have some items related to apartment 3A. There have been some changes in the tenancy situation, and we want to make sure everyone understands the current status." This was their moment. Tanner stood up, smoothing his shirt and adopting the earnest expression of someone about to deliver difficult but necessary news. "Thank you, Carla," he said, addressing the room. "I know some of you have been concerned about the situation with my wife, Allison. It's been a difficult time for our family, and I want to be transparent about what's happened." He paused, letting his words sink in. Several residents leaned forward, clearly eager to hear the official story. "Allison has been struggling with some mental health issues," Tanner continued, his voice heavy with false concern. "The stress of new motherhood, combined with some underlying problems, has made it impossible for her to manage the responsibilities of maintaining our home. For the safety of our son and the stability of the building community, we've had to make the difficult decision to have her seek treatment elsewhere." Murmurs of sympathy rippled through the room. I watched faces around me, seeing how easily people accepted Tanner's lie when it was delivered with apparent sincerity and concern. "My mother has moved in temporarily to help with childcare and household management," Tanner continued. "We're hoping that with proper support and treatment, Allison will eventually be able to return home. But for now, we need to prioritize Ethan's well-being and the stability of our living situation." Darlene stood up beside her son, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "It's been heartbreaking," she said, her voice quavering with manufactured emotion. "Watching a young mother struggle like this, knowing that a precious child is caught in the middle. But sometimes love means making hard choices." The performance was masterful. Around the room, I could see residents nodding in understanding and approval. Tanner and Darlene had positioned themselves as the responsible adults, making difficult decisions for the good of a troubled family member. "We also want to address some concerns about Franklin Carver," Tanner continued, glancing back at me with what looked like genuine compassion. "Allison's father has been understandably upset about the situation. He's been making some accusations and threats that we believe stem from his difficulty accepting his daughter's condition. We don't want to involve law enforcement, but we may need to consider a restraining order if his harassment continues." More murmurs, this time with an edge of concern. I could feel the mood in the room shifting against me, see people looking at me with a mixture of pity and wariness. It was exactly what I'd been waiting for. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward me. Tanner's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "Thank you for that." "Interesting presentation, Tanner," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I wonder if I might offer a different perspective on the situation." "Mr. Carver," Carla said carefully, "this is really a family matter." "Actually," Marcia O'Neill said, rising beside me, "this is a legal matter. My name is Marcia O'Neill, and I'm Mr. Carver's attorney. We're here tonight to address some serious allegations of fraud, theft, and harassment." The word attorney sent a ripple of tension through the room. Tanner's confident expression faltered, and Darlene's theatrical grief transformed into something harder and more calculating. "Now wait just a minute," Tanner said, his voice rising slightly. "You can't just come in here and—" "Actually, we can," I said, pulling out the folder I'd prepared. "Because this is a community meeting, and the community deserves to know the truth about what's been happening in apartment 3A. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, the original deed to the apartment, clearly showing Allison's name as the sole owner. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, holding up the deed for everyone to see, "I'd like you to meet the actual legal owner of apartment 3A. My daughter, Allison Carver Benson, who is not mentally ill, not unstable, and not in treatment anywhere. She's at home with her son, where she's been staying since Tanner and his mother illegally evicted her from her own apartment." The silence in the room was deafening. I could see people processing this information, comparing it to the story they'd just heard from Tanner. "That's not," Darlene started to say, but I cut her off. "I have documentation," I continued, pulling out more papers. "Forged maintenance request signed with my daughter's name, evidence of mail tampering, photographs of Tanner and Darlene disposing of my daughter's personal belongings in the building dumpster, witness statements from residents who heard them planning this theft months in advance." I looked directly at Greg Harlan, who stood up slowly. "It's true," Greg said, his voice quiet but clear. "I saw them throwing away family photos, children's toys, personal items, and I heard them discussing how to get rid of Allison and take over the apartment." Carla Newton also stood up, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "I have records of Mrs. Benson requesting building documents and asking about procedures for changing property deeds," she said. "She told me she needed them because of legal complications, but now I understand she was planning to steal the apartment." The mood in the room was shifting rapidly. I could see people looking at Tanner and Darlene with new eyes, reassessing everything they'd been told. "This is ridiculous," Tanner said, his voice cracking slightly. "You can't believe these wild accusations. My wife is sick, and her father is obviously—" "Your wife," Marcia O'Neill interrupted, "is the victim of a systematic campaign of abuse, theft, and fraud. We have evidence of document forgery, mail tampering, illegal eviction, and conspiracy to commit property fraud, all of which are serious crimes." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "We also have a court order," she continued, "signed this afternoon by Judge Patricia Hendricks, requiring Tanner Benson and Darlene Benson to vacate apartment 3A immediately and return all property belonging to Allison Carver Benson." The court order was like a bomb going off in the room. Tanner's face went white, and Darlene's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "Furthermore," Marcia continued, "we'll be filing criminal charges for mail fraud, document forgery, and theft. The FBI has been notified about the mail tampering, and the district attorney's office is reviewing the case for prosecution." I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each resident who'd been taken in by Tanner and Darlene's lies. "My daughter is not mentally ill," I said quietly. "She's not unstable. She's not a danger to her child. She's a good mother and a good person who was victimized by two criminals who thought they could steal from my family without consequences." I turned to face Tanner and Darlene directly. "You made one critical mistake," I said. "You assumed that because I'm older, because I'm quiet, because I try to avoid conflict, that meant I was weak. You thought you could humiliate my daughter, steal her home, and destroy her reputation without anyone fighting back." Tanner was staring at me with something approaching shock, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time. "You were wrong," I continued. "And now everyone in this room knows exactly who you really are." The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, people began to murmur among themselves. I caught fragments of conversation, expressions of shock, embarrassment, anger at being deceived. Tanner and Darlene sat in their chairs like statues, the full weight of their exposure settling over them. Their carefully constructed lies had collapsed in a matter of minutes, replaced by documented evidence of their crimes. "The sheriff's department will be here within the hour to oversee the eviction," Marcia announced. "Mr. and Mrs. Benson, you have that long to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises." As people began to file out of the room, several residents approached me to apologize for believing Tanner and Darlene's lies. Others offered to help in any way they could. The tide had turned completely. Tanner and Darlene had gone from respected residents to exposed criminals in the span of 30 minutes. But the best moment came as I was preparing to leave. Tanner approached me, his arrogance finally replaced by something that looked like genuine fear. "Frank," he said quietly, "maybe we can work something out. Some kind of arrangement?" "The only arrangement," I replied, "is the one the court has ordered. You have 55 minutes to get out of my daughter's apartment." As I walked toward the door, I heard Darlene's voice behind me, high and desperate. "This isn't over," she called out. "You think you've won? But this isn't over. I paused in the doorway and looked back at her. You're right, I said. It's not over. The criminal trial hasn't even started yet. Then I walked out of the building and drove home to tell my daughter that it was time to come home. The sheriff's deputies arrived at the apartment building at exactly 9 p.m., their patrol cars casting red and blue lights across the brick facade. I stood in the courtyard with Marcia O'Neill, watching as residents gathered at their windows to witness the final act of Tanner and Darlene's humiliation. Sheriff's Deputy Patricia Valdez approached us with the court-ordered eviction notice in her hand. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and the kind of steady presence that came from years of dealing with people at their worst. Mr. Carver, she said, I understand you're the property owner. I am. The apartment belongs to my daughter, Allison Carver Benson, who was illegally evicted by her husband and mother-in-law. Deputy Valdez nodded, reviewing the paperwork. We've been briefed on the situation. Mail fraud, document forgery, theft of personal property. The DA's office is very interested in this case. As we made our way into the building, I noticed that word had spread beyond the tenant meeting. Several neighbors from adjacent buildings had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the police presence and the rumors that were already circulating through the neighborhood. The elevator ride to the third floor was silent, except for the soft crackle of Deputy Valdez's radio. When we reached apartment 3A, I could hear voices inside, Tanner and Darlene arguing in harsh whispers about something. Deputy Valdez knocked firmly on the door. Sheriff's Department, open up, please. The voices inside went silent. After a long moment, Tanner opened the door, his face pale and his hair disheveled. Behind him, I could see Darlene frantically stuffing items into garbage bags. Tanner Benson? Deputy Valdez asked. Yes. I have a court order requiring you and Darlene Benson to vacate these premises immediately. She handed him the document. You have 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings and leave. This is insane, Tanner said, his voice cracking. This is my home, my wife. Your wife is the legal owner of this apartment, Deputy Valdez interrupted, and according to multiple witness statements, you and your mother forcibly evicted her and stole her property. You're lucky you're not in handcuffs right now. I stepped forward, looking past Tanner into the apartment that had been my daughter's home. What I saw there filled me with a cold satisfaction. The expensive furniture Tanner and Darlene had moved in was scattered around the room in various stages of being packed. The walls, which they'd repainted stark white, were now marked with nail holes and scuff marks from their hasty attempts to remove their belongings. The apartment that had once been warm and welcoming, filled with Allison's careful decorating and family photos, looked like a crime scene, which I supposed it was. Where are my daughter's belongings? I asked Tanner. I told you, we donated. You told me you threw them in the dumpster, I corrected. Greg Harlan has photographs of you disposing of family photos and children's toys. So let me ask you again. What did you do with my daughter's furniture, her clothes, her personal items? Tanner's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Behind him, Darlene had stopped packing and was staring at me with undisguised hatred. Some of it's in storage, she said finally. Unit 47 at Secure Space on Industrial Boulevard. The rest we sold. You sold my daughter's belongings? We needed money for the apartment improvements, Darlene said defiantly. The furniture was shabby, and You took my daughter's property and sold it, I said, my voice cold and controlled. Add that to the list of charges, Deputy Valdez. As Tanner and Darlene continued their frantic packing, more people began to gather in the hallway. Word of the eviction had spread throughout the building, and residents were emerging from their apartments to witness the spectacle. Among them was Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, an elderly woman from apartment 2B who had always been kind to Allison and Ethan. She approached me with tears in her eyes. Mr. Carver, I'm so sorry, she said. If I had known what was really happening, if I had known they were lying. It's not your fault, Mrs. Fitzgerald. They're very convincing liars. That poor girl, she continued. And little Ethan. How could anyone do such a thing to their own family? Her words carried clearly down the hallway, and I saw Tanner flinch as if he'd been struck. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I thought I saw a flicker of genuine shame cross his features. But it was too little, too late. Marcia O'Neill approached with a clipboard full of legal documents. Franklin, we need to do an inventory of what's been damaged or removed from the apartment. Everything will be evidence in the criminal trial. As we walked through the apartment, documenting the destruction Tanner and Darlene had wrought, I was struck by the thoroughness of their erasure of my daughter's life. They hadn't just stolen her home, they'd tried to eliminate every trace that she'd ever lived there. The walls where family photos had hung were marked with unfaded rectangles of paint. The kitchen cabinets had been emptied of Allison's dishes and cookware, replaced with items I didn't recognize. Even Ethan's bedroom had been stripped bare, his toys and books and the carefully chosen decorations that had made it a little boy's sanctuary all thrown away like garbage. "The damage assessment alone will be substantial," Marcia said, making notes. "New paint, replacement of personal property, emotional distress. We're looking at significant civil damages in addition to the criminal charges." 20 minutes later, Tanner and Darlene emerged from the apartment carrying their hastily packed belongings. Tanner had 3 garbage bags and a suitcase. Darlene was struggling with an overflowing cardboard box and what appeared to be several pieces of jewelry I was fairly certain had belonged to Allison. "Ma'am," Deputy Valdez said, stopping Darlene, "I need to inspect that jewelry." "It's mine," Darlene said quickly. "I bought it myself." "Then you won't mind if Mr. Carver takes a look." I examined the jewelry in the box. Among the pieces was a pearl necklace that had belonged to Allison's grandmother and a pair of earrings I'd given Allison for her college graduation. "Those belong to my daughter," I said. "You can't prove that," Darlene snapped. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photos until I found one from Allison's wedding day. In the picture, she was wearing both the necklace and the earrings, smiling radiantly as she posed with her new husband. "I can prove it," I said, showing the photo to Deputy Valdez. The deputy removed the jewelry from Darlene's box and handed it to me. Theft of personal property, another charge for the DA. As Tanner and Darlene made their way toward the elevator, carrying their belongings like refugees fleeing a disaster, the hallway filled with residents watching their departure. The same people who had listened sympathetically to their lies about Allison were now witnessing their exposure and eviction. Greg Harlan stepped forward as they passed. "I hope it was worth it," he said quietly. "Destroying a family for an apartment you never had any right to." Tanner stopped and turned to face him, his expression desperate. "You don't understand. Allison really was having problems. We were trying to help." "By throwing away her family photos?" Greg interrupted. "By forging her signature on documents? By telling everyone she was mentally ill?" Tanner had no answer. He and his mother continued toward the elevator in silence, their heads down and their shoulders hunched with shame. But the most devastating moment came as they waited for the elevator doors to open. Mrs. Fitzgerald approached them, her elderly frame trembling with indignation. "I want you to know," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hallway, "that I've called my daughter. She works for Channel 7 News. She's very interested in this story, about how a young mother was victimized by her own husband and his mother, how they stole her home and tried to destroy her reputation." Darlene's face went white. "You can't—" "I can, and I have," Mrs. Fitzgerald continued. "Everyone in this neighborhood is going to know exactly what kind of people you are. Everyone is going to know what you did to that sweet girl and her little boy." The elevator doors opened, and Tanner and Darlene stepped inside. As the doors began to close, I heard Darlene's voice, high and desperate. "This isn't over, Franklin. We'll fight this. We'll—" The doors closed, cutting off her words. Deputy Valdez turned to me with the apartment keys in her hand. "Mr. Carver, the premises are now secured. Your daughter can return whenever she's ready." I took the keys, the same keys I'd given Allison as a wedding gift 18 months ago, and felt their familiar weight in my palm. Around me, the residents who had gathered to witness Tanner and Darlene's eviction began to disperse, talking quietly among themselves about what they'd seen. Carla Newton approached me as I prepared to leave. "Mr. Carver, I want to apologize. I should have questioned their story more carefully. I should have protected your daughter." "You did what you thought was right with the information you had," I replied. "They're very good at lying." "Well, they won't be lying to anyone else in this building. I'll make sure of that." As I walked back to my car, I pulled out my phone and called Allison. "Dad?" Her voice was tense with anticipation. "It's done," I said. "Come home, sweetheart. Both of you, come home." The next morning, as I helped Allison and Ethan move back into their apartment, I reflected on the events of the past week. Tanner and Darlene had made a fundamental miscalculation about who they were dealing with. They'd seen an aging father and a vulnerable young mother, and they'd assumed that made us easy targets. They'd forgotten that love makes people dangerous. They'd forgotten that patience can be a weapon. They'd forgotten that sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should fear the most. As I watched my grandson run through his recovered bedroom, laughing with joy at being reunited with his toys and books, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge